is return to work. That is putting more people into the public domain. And I think that there has to be a realism about the ability of people. We're now 6 or 7 weeks into quite a remarkable time where there's been a restriction on personal liberty and personal freedom that I would never have envisaged. I don't think any of us would. And for the people of the United Kingdom to have complied as they have, I think is really quite remarkable. So I think inevitably there's going to be an element of compliance realism has to be brought to bear about how sustainable is it to expect people to continue to live their lives with such restrictions. Thus far, they've done it really, really well, but we do have to keep our eye on the reality of people's behaviour as well as the regulations that are in place.
Ian Livingston, Chief Constable of Police Scotland, thank you.
The time now is 14 minutes past 7. We do seem a long way from Thursday's newspaper headlines. Lockdown freedom, happy Monday, stay-at-home advice to be scrapped. When the Prime Minister appears in a broadcast to the nation tomorrow, he's expected only to talk about limited moves for England. We've just been hearing about Scotland, and Wales is already extending the lockdown. In fact, today we're getting news of tighter restrictions. That's for airline passengers to the UK who'll have to spend 2 weeks in quarantine. And there are reports that anybody going back to work will have to wear face coverings. Let's talk now to our political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Nick, what are we expecting from the Prime Minister tomorrow?
I think we'll see a very cautious approach from the government in the immediate term anyway. We've heard ministers and Downing Street talk about very limited changes being brought in next week. One of them will be that garden centres in England can reopen if they can adhere to social distancing rules. We know that in Wales the exercise cap is being lifted. Scotland's looking at the same, so perhaps that's something that we'll start to see in England too. But I don't think there'll be any radical changes to our lives starting next week. You know, ministers keep talking about a roadmap to lifting restrictions, which suggests that finding that new normal, as ministers have put it, may be a fairly lengthy process.
So we're unlikely to be hearing about schools opening up and lots of people going back to work?
Well, it's possible that we'll hear about how that decision will be made and the criteria that may have to be met before that decision is made. I think there is some reluctance to put too definitive a date on any of these longer or medium-term prospects, for the simple reason that if they are not met, there will be a great deal of disappointment. Ministers don't want to muddy the message that they're putting out next week, so I wouldn't expect to, have a calendar of changes that will come in the next few weeks.
But we are likely to hear about quarantine for people coming into the UK, including British people returning from abroad.
Yes, so we're expecting travellers coming into Britain to be told they'll have to quarantine for a fortnight within the next few weeks. That won't include lorry drivers, key workers or people from the Republic of Ireland. They'll have to provide an address where they will self-isolate for that 2-week period. This is something that won't be popular with airlines. They've tried to discourage the government from doing it so far. But more broadly, there has been that question, hasn't there, about how people coming into the country are being checked, whether enough is being done. I think this is aimed towards avoiding a second peak, a second situation where, the disease is brought into the UK. That's what ministers are looking towards just now.
And finally, this question of face coverings. There's a report in the Telegraph this morning about that.
Well, the Prime Minister has already said that he thinks face coverings will be useful in the next phase of the reaction to coronavirus. I would expect them to be part of the strategy that we get early next week. But what isn't completely clear at the moment is about how widespread that will be. I don't think they'll be compulsory. I think there might be some encouragement to wear them. But it's not clear whether that will just be on transport, whether it will be in certain settings. For example, Scotland, people are being encouraged to wear face coverings if they go into shops and can't adhere to social distancing rules. It doesn't seem that it's going to be completely across the board, but those details we'll get tomorrow.
Nick Eardley, many thanks.
It's 19 minutes past 7. The World Health Organization says there are worrying trends in the spread of coronavirus in countries from Haiti to Somalia to Yemen and including Syria. It says it may have to cancel millions of dollars in aid to Syria because of President Trump's suspension of US funding. In the conflict-ravaged province of Idlib, one health official says the virus could cost 100,000 lives. Mike Thompson has this report.
More than 1 million people displaced in Idlib since December, many living in crowded camps or on the streets, and a healthcare system shattered by 9 years of war. The coronavirus could be devastating for this mainly rebel-held province.
Because of my disability, I have to go to hospital very often. This means I have more chance of getting infected, and that's why I am particularly worried.
40-year-old Omar Al-Halaf is paralyzed from the waist down.
Health services in our area are almost nothing. They lack support and cannot cope with serious health issues.
Idlib has no confirmed coronavirus cases yet, but with fewer than 2 doctors for every 10,000 people, medical staff are nonetheless bracing themselves.
After a real war of weapons, bombardment, displacement, now it will be like a biological attack in northwest Syria.
Dr. Omar Al-Haraki, a surgeon at Idlib's Bab al-Hawa hospital, says even without the threatened $30 million cut in funding from the World Health Organization, his region was already struggling.
The WHO has not provided us with any support or fund or equipment. On the other hand, they provide the Assad regime with millions of dollars.
The World Health Organization is talking to other donors in the hope of avoiding its threatened cut to Idlib, and plans to set up 2 new testing labs there within the next few weeks. But with the province currently limited to just a couple of dozen coronavirus tests a day, Dr. Omar's fears are echoed by the head of Idlib's Health Directorate, Dr. Munza Khalil.
In the worst case scenario, we expect that more than 100,000 persons will die because we don't have human resources, we don't have hospitals, we don't have ventilators, we don't have patient bed, there is nothing. And the suffering of people will be more than chemical attacks, barrel bomb, rocket.
So at the moment, the threat posed by the coronavirus to people's lives is even greater than the war.
Yeah, actually I think that.
Much needed medical aid, like this shipment, can still get to Idlib from Turkey, but northeast Syria is less fortunate. Most of its medical supplies had come through Iraq via the Al-Yurabiya border crossing, but that is still closed. This leaves the autonomous Kurdish region dependent on the goodwill of President Assad. Dr. Sherwan Berry is the health manager there for the Kurdish Red Crescent.
The only help that is coming from the WHO is coming after the approval of Damascus.
How cooperative is Damascus tending to be?
Actually, there is no cooperation at all, I can say.
So far, northeast Syria has just 4 confirmed coronavirus cases, with 1 fatality. It now has 2 testing devices of its own, easing its previous reliance on uncooperative Damascus labs. But with its war-ravaged health service near broken and very limited access to medical supplies, Dr. Berry dreads what will happen if COVID-19 takes hold there.
In the worst scenario, we think maybe about 30,000 people could be dead.
Thankfully, there's been less of this in most parts of northern Syria since a ceasefire agreed by Russia and Turkey in early March. But even if that holds, civilians like Omar Al-Halaf fear there may be no reprieve from the coming battle with COVID-19.
We can do nothing. We just ask God for help, because we have no way of dealing with this situation ourselves.
That report from Mike Thompson. The time now is 23 minutes past 7. The village of Moniaive in Dumfries and Galloway in southwest Scotland should be bursting with thousands of visitors to its folk festival this weekend. But, of course, that's been cancelled, and the area's businesses, artists and musicians are fearful that they just won't be able to manage without the lost income. Zoe Conway reports.
We're going to play a tune called Callum's Road, which is a beautiful story about a lighthouse keeper on one of the Scottish islands.
Greg Lawson and Pete Garnett and their band Moishy's Bagel were supposed to be playing this weekend at the Money Ive Folk Festival.
Money Ive's a bit like the Archers on acid, you know, it's quite an amazing place.
What do you mean?
Well, we just do things our own way here, and we just try and make things happen with limited means, usually.
There must be quite a number of people seriously worried about their livelihoods.
At the moment, things are fine, you know, but quite soon, money's going to start running out, and it's hard to kind of maintain a kind of optimistic, artistic, creative lifestyle when you're worried about no food in the cupboard. So, lots of rabbits, though, around here, I suppose, if it comes to it. Start playing banjo music.
Money Ive lost all of its tourism in the 2001 foot and mouth outbreak. To make up for all the lost earnings, the community organised the festival. It's been happening ever since.
It should be absolute chaos in here right now. The bar's behind us, the bar should be packed.
Tim O'Sullivan is the landlord of the Craig Darroch pub.
I've absolutely no idea what we'll do this year without it.
The festival attracts 2,000 visitors and brings in £70,000 to local businesses.
Something's going to have to be done, otherwise I don't know how we'll still be here next year.
Really?
Yeah, none of us make a lot of money. We haven't got vast sums in the bank. The worry is that the village could quite easily become a ghost village with just houses, people living here and nothing. In a wee place like this, the pub is the social centre, it's everything. Without that, you may as well live on a housing estate in the middle of nowhere.
I'm Graham Watson, I'm the grocer in Money Ive.
And tell me what you're wearing.
Red rubber gloves with a diamante ring and leopard print. It's leopard print, yeah.
Now, the bins.
So we've got yin and yang, there's 2 bins, and one bin is food, anything I can afford to put in the bins for people to come and help themselves. And yang is an empty bin, so people who are in a position to do so and have surplus food to put in for goodwill that can be then given away.
Are you worried about people in the village at the moment?
Yeah, it's the people that are running under the radar, who are very proud, who don't want to ask for help but need help. There's a lot of these people because it's a very rural area, so sincerely, yeah, there's a lot of people with nothing.
If you want to go in for Second World War analogies, then the Money Ive munitions factory is to be found in Nettie Scribb's front room. She's churning out 40 face masks a day.
Nettie, the reason why I'm poking my microphone through your window is because I was told it's like a Henry Ford production line going on here.
I feel very honoured, actually. I feel I'm helping in a tinsy way, but I'm helping. That's all we need, is to look out for each other, be kind, and stay at home, of course.
Zoe Conway reporting there. It's 27 minutes past 7, time to join Gary for this morning's sports news. Morning, Gary.
Very good morning to you. As we know, there's been no football for just over 2 months, and whether it's going to return this season depends largely on what the Prime Minister says tomorrow about easing the lockdown. On Monday, Premier League clubs will meet to digest what Boris Johnson has said and then form their plans on what to do next. Correspondent John Murray joins us. John, good morning.
Morning, Gary.
Germany due to start next week, and then the Premier League set to hold a series of meetings with clubs.
Yes, so the meeting on Monday, you're right, they'll talk about whatever the Prime Minister says tomorrow, but there'll also be further discussions about how full training would resume, which they would want to do the week after next, with a view to the Premier League coming back in the middle of June. They will talk about the issue of players' contracts, those coming to an end on the 30th of June, the loan players, etc., and also the proposals to play the remaining 92 Premier League matches at neutral grounds. And we know that Brighton and Aston Villa have both spoken publicly against that this week. I see the Watford Chief Executive Scott Duxbury has expressed his concerns about that in the Times this morning. And I remember on this programme this week, Richard Bevan, the head of the League Managers Association, Gary, said to you if any clubs vote against neutral grounds, he feels that would probably mean the end of the season.
Now, John, in that answer, you talked about one of the keys, full training, and that is the big issue. It will actually all hinge on the players agreeing, won't it?
Yeah, and I don't think we can underplay how the players might feel about this, because A number of them have expressed doubts publicly, such as Sergio Aguero of Manchester City, Glenn Murray of Brighton, Manuel Lanzini of West Ham. The medical protocol for the resumption will have to be agreed with the club doctors and the medical staff, and the players will have to agree to that. Also, there is the issue of testing and PPE. So I think how this works in Germany in the build-up to next weekend and when they start playing in the Bundesliga, I think that's going to be very carefully watched and monitored.
And tell us about Scotland. There was a meeting of clubs yesterday. What's the situation there now?
Yeah, well, the Aberdeen chairman, Dave Cormack, spoke on behalf of the Premiership clubs, and he said that they had concluded that this is not the right time to consider any immediate reconstruction of the league system in Scotland, which is what they've been talking about yesterday, and that they will pick up on those discussions once we're through the current crisis. But that means that Hearts would be relegated if and when the decision comes from the SPFL board to end the current season.
John Murray, thank you very much indeed, and there'll be more from me in an hour.
We shall look forward to that. Thank you, Gary. And now at 7:30, let's look ahead to wartime drama on Radio 4 this afternoon.
This isn't a pleasure cruise.
You're telling me. Havana,
fleeing 1939 Germany.
Why shouldn't it be allowed to land in Cuba?
Maybe because there are 900 refugees on board.
A true story adapted for radio by Tom Stoppard.
No refugee is to set foot in Cuba.
But, Your Excellency...
Close the door behind you.
The Voyage of the St. Louis, starring Toby Jones, Paul Ritter and Philip Glenister.
We have a job which we will carry out. And part of that job is to treat these passengers like any other passengers.
This afternoon at 2:45 on BBC Radio 4.
And the weather, it'll be warm today with sunny spells for many, but also heavy and thundery showers, cloudy and colder in the north.
The time now is 29 minutes to 8. You're listening to Today on BBC Radio 4 with Michelle Hussain and Martha Carney. Here's a summary of the news from Zed Soanes.
British-based airlines have been told that the government will introduce a 14-day quarantine period for almost everybody arriving in the UK. The measures are expected to come into effect at the end of the month, but key workers and lorry drivers would be exempt. The aviation industry says it could be badly damaged by new restrictions. The Home Office has refused to comment on the leak. It's expected that the Transport Secretary will today encourage people to walk and cycle more when lockdown measures are relaxed. It's believed that Grant Shapps will talk about using the unique opportunity of the restrictions to change the way we get to work. There are fears roads could become gridlocked as people resume commuting. The Queen has addressed the nation to mark the 75th anniversary of VE Day, praising Britain's response to coronavirus that has filled empty streets with love. In the broadcast from Windsor Castle, she said VE Day had a message for today's generation as it deals with the pandemic. Never give up, never despair. Teaching unions are urging the government to not reopen schools in England until strong measures can be put in place to stop the spread of coronavirus. They've written to the Education Secretary Gavin Williamson demanding extra money for deep cleaning and personal protective equipment and local powers to close schools if infections spread. The press secretary of the US Vice President Mike Pence has tested positive for COVID-19. Katie Miller, who is married to a senior advisor to President Trump, is the second White House worker to test positive for the virus this week. The public have been warned that criminals are increasingly using the coronavirus crisis to sell fake COVID-related products, such as testing kits and protective equipment. More than 500,000 substandard face masks were taken off the market by one London council. Research by psychologists suggests that young men are more likely to break lockdown rules than young women. They also found a link between adolescents' mental health and how likely they were to practice social distancing and regular hand washing.
Thanks, Zeb. It's 27 minutes to 8. Welcome to Britain. Now spend 2 weeks in quarantine. That's what passengers to the UK, including British people returning from abroad, will be told from the end of the month. Airlines have been briefed that travellers will have to self-isolate in a private dwelling for 14 days, apart from those arriving from the Republic of Ireland and some key workers like lorry drivers delivering supplies. Well, to see how all of this might work, we can talk now to Tim Jeans, who's chairman of Cornwall Airport Newquay and was a senior manager at Ryanair, MyTravel and Monarch Airlines. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So do you think this move was inevitable?
It was possibly inevitable, but to say that it's come too late would be something of an understatement. I think everybody observing the development of this pandemic began to question why airports and borders, as not just airports but seaports as well, were fully open when they were being so restricted in other countries. And yet here we are 7 weeks after the lockdown, and this has been announced potentially to come in at the end of the month with an indeterminate cut-off. So certainly questioning the management and the planning of this is going to be very much at the forefront today.
I mean, what has been said, is reported in the Times coming from the government, is that it wouldn't make any difference to introduce this earlier because the virus was already so prevalent in the country.
Well, that's true, and forgive me, I'm certainly no expert in that regard, but if we look at the example of other countries and other countries that have successfully managed this pandemic, and New Zealand comes to mind, lockdown was part of the initial response. And our initial response was that the borders were going to remain open. And now it does look, even though we're now potentially past the peak, we're now going to close our borders, and all the plans that airlines and airports had to start restarting operations are now on the scrap heap, and we'll have to go back to square one.
So what will it mean for your airport?
Well, at the moment, the airport terminal is closed. The plan was to open again on the 1st of July, and airlines had indicated to us that that was when they planned to start flying. Clearly, at the moment, we have no official confirmation of this new measure, but it looks to me as if it may well delay the opening of the airport, and really that's the summer season, particularly for tourists coming to Cornwall from Germany, from Scandinavia and elsewhere. That's the end as far as this summer is concerned, and that is just going to add to the difficulties that business and tourism generally faces in the county, and I'm sure elsewhere in the country.
Really, what kind of impact do you think it's likely to have on airports and airlines more generally?
Well, of course, there's a huge supply chain in the aviation industry, so it's not just the airlines and airports themselves, but all the related businesses, everything from car hire to airport hotels to airport shops, a vast link of people and supply is now going to be affected. It's not just those two big, if you like, those two big players, and so the staff and the people that have been furloughed and now unfortunately potentially made redundant, that only adds to the uncertainty, because it looks like we'll start the measure with no cut-off currently in place.
Tim Jeans, thank you. We can also talk now to Lucy Morton, who's a professional officer of the ISU. That's the Union for People Working in Borders, Immigration and Customs. Good morning.
Good morning.
How do you see this working?
Well, at the moment, this is just a leak, so we haven't had any particular information. But what's happening at the moment, if you arrive in a UK airport right now and you feel that you've been exposed or you're symptomatic, there is a form that you can complete that puts your details to Public Health England. It's quite possible it'll run along those sorts of lines, that arriving passengers will give information which will then be passed over to either PHE or presumably there's some suggestion of the police checking this. But at the end of the day, this is, at the moment, only by consent. People will tell us where they're proposing to self-isolate, but without the mechanism to check on it and enforce it, there's a bit of a question as to how useful that would be. There's a little bit of a discrepancy about whether this is airline passengers only or whether this is going to include individuals arriving by boat. We still have people coming in on the ferries, and what we're going to do with the irregular migrants who don't have a private house to self-isolate in.
These are people who are arriving here illegally, you're saying?
Yes, individuals from small boats or found in the back of lorries, those sorts of things. They're housed by the state, but they're almost exclusively young males, and so they're housed in multiple occupation. and that's not, you can't self-isolate in a property where you share bathroom facilities or kitchen facilities.
So what more information do you think you would like to have about this initiative?
Well, I'm hoping someone will get round to telling the staff at some point. What we were told as an organisation was that this announcement, whatever it was, that was before the leak, would have no impact on how we run the border control operation. So I'm assuming at this point that whatever the border force staff are being asked to do in this respect is going to be absolutely minimal. If that's just collecting addresses and passing that on to another authority, that's not going to add significantly to the pressure that they're under. There aren't that many people travelling at the moment, so it shouldn't add to queues particularly. How we're going to manage that with e-gates at the moment, all European passengers and passengers from 7 other nations, including America, Singapore, they pass through the e-gates. They don't see a human being. There's no way for that e-gate to collect an address, so we'd have to do something, either shut those down completely or post staff before or after to collect addresses.
What kind of legal powers do you have?
We do, under the Coronavirus Act, actually have the power, as do the police, to enforce a quarantine. But if we did that, we would then have to accommodate individuals. You're imprisoning someone for 14 days, and the logistics around that then become much more complicated. It's not my understanding that that's what's being proposed. I understand that this is simply an honour-based system, telling people that they must isolate and then trusting them to do it.
Lucy Morton from the ISU, thank you.
It's 20 to 8. Let's have a look at some of the morning's newspapers and news websites. Never give up, never despair is the message taken to heart into headlines from the Queen's address to the nation last night as part of VE Day commemorations. The Daily Telegraph is one of many to give it front-page prominence alongside a picture of the Queen, surrounded by meaningful items such as the cap she used during her time serving in the auxiliary services and a photograph of her father, King George VI. Soaring and electrifying was the verdict of the Daily Mail on the Queen's words.
The Daily Express gives lots of coverage to personal experience, publishing a photo of 92-year-old Lou Myers, a veteran of the Second World War, who insisted on attending the cenotaph yesterday. The paper reports that as he stood in tribute with his head bowed, there were only a few paramedics present to applaud his huge effort.
The contrast between the crowds in London during VE Day in 1945 and the relatively empty streets of yesterday is reflected by the Sun's souvenir cover. It shows a black and white photograph of Buckingham Palace from VE Day, complete with throngs of people celebrating the momentous occasion. That blends into an image taken at the palace yesterday in full colour but with no joyful crowds because of the coronavirus crisis. Paramedic Kerry Johnson, one of the few people to watch the Red Arrows fly past on Horse Guards parade, tells the paper it was an emotional moment. I thought of those who sacrificed their lives for our freedom, she says, and those we've lost in the NHS. I'm proud to wear my uniform.
Elsewhere, the papers look forward specifically to what they can expect from Boris Johnson's announcement tomorrow on plans to ease the lockdown. Furlough phase-out plan takes shape is the claim of the Financial Times. Its front page suggests that the Treasury is considering a more gradual exit from the scheme than had been originally planned for June, with some workers allowed to return part-time.
Teachers' concerns about the reopening of schools makes the front page of The Guardian. June 1st, school plans in doubt, says the paper, as it reports that unions representing teachers and other school staff are insisting they can't back a return to work for their members until a stringent coronavirus test and trace regime is in place. The Guardian says such demands make it unlikely that the June 1st deadline floated by officials last week could be met.
Johnson's honeymoon is well and truly over is the view of Patrick O'Flynn, writing The Spectator. He points to healthy Conservative poll ratings of 50% as evidence that so far public faith is not for budging. But he says there's a change in the air which suggests chillier times ahead for the government. O'Flynn warns that Boris Johnson must do better and find a way of reassuring the British people, because that period when he can do no wrong is drawing to a close.
17 minutes to 8. British diplomats and their families in missions around the world are running a virtual marathon relay today to raise money for NHS charities and for the United Nations Children's Fund. Among those taking part is Jane Marriott, the UK High Commissioner to Kenya, and she's on the line now. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm just finishing up my mile, so sorry for the breathlessness.
Totally understandable. How far have you run as part of this?
Only 1 mile, so it's 3,300 diplomats and their families globally, from somewhere in the Pacific over to Canada, finishing in Vancouver. We're doing a mile each, and we're handing on real or virtual batons. Most inventive baton so far is a banana. I wanted to use a bottle of hand sanitizer, but my colleague said a banana would be more amusing.
And are you running on the spot, or are you running in your garden?
So in Kenya, we're sort of only partially sort of locked down, so I'm actually running in the local forest, surrounded by lots of other people who are running in masks, socially distancing.
And you're doing it all for these very good causes, NHS charities together, and also the UN's Children's Fund. I mean, how connected have you managed to keep to what's happening here? Because I imagine your daily work, a lot of it must have been taken up with repatriation and virus-related issues in Kenya in the last few weeks.
Absolutely. So sort of the real focus has been getting British nationals back home who want to go, but also quite a lot of our own families have gone back to the UK from Kenya, from across the world. So this is just a really good way of staying connected. It was the brainchild of our acting ambassador in Afghanistan, Ian Collard, and his wife. She's in the UK, he's in Afghanistan, and this is just kind of a global way of staying connected, really good community spirit, and a very good cause. And of course, we've all got families. We've just done my dad's 80th birthday by Zoom celebration, so staying very closely in touch and aware of what's going on in the UK.
Have you managed to get all those British citizens who needed to be repatriated back now?
Not all of them, but we've been doing it commercially rather than through charters, because there's still ad hoc commercial flights. So we've negotiated 5 flights so far with Kenyan authorities, another one on the 14th of May, and I hope that the rest of the British nationals will be able to get on that, including using government loans as necessary to get on those flights.
Because I imagine they are expensive.
It's usually about sort of £600-700 for a single. It's about double that, but then we are in a global pandemic.
How much further have you got to run?
I am done. My breathlessness now is me recovering.
So have you handed
kind of way.
Have you handed over the banana?
The banana has been handed over to my colleague Anna, and then shortly we'll hand over to our embassy in Uganda, having picked up the banana baton from Addis.
Okay, and on it will go. Thank you very much, Jane Marriott, UK High Commissioner to Kenya.
I think we should make all our guests run as they do the interviews. The time now is just after 7:45, and time for Thought for the Day. The speaker in the studio this morning is the Reverend Dr. Rob Marshall, Rector of Digswell in Welwyn Garden City.
Good morning. Dr. Hans Kluger, the World Health Organization's Regional Director for Europe, said on this programme yesterday, "We have a responsibility to take care of each other in society and to leave no one behind. It's clear," he said, "that new things are being learnt about the pandemic every day and that the main danger was a second wave." But his main concern was pastoral for children in lockdown and potential collateral mental health issues, as well as for the elderly and all those in care homes. As we all wait for updated guidance from the government tomorrow, the challenge to leave no one behind remains as important as ever. Even in normal times, I've never met anyone faced with placing a loved one in a care home who hasn't asked themselves the question, am I doing the right thing? Add to that now the inability to give a hug, hold a hand, be alongside loved ones has made it excruciatingly difficult. It's also been really hard for parents and carers looking after children at home, often juggling work with all of life's usual daily tasks, whilst at the same time asking, what effect is all this going to have on the children's future? What about our responsibility here? Bishop Rowan Williams on Newsnight a few weeks ago was asked to reflect spiritually on how the virus would affect our mutual well-being and flourishing. Faced with insecurity on this scale, we realise, he said, how very poorly equipped we are as a society to look after those who can't so easily look after themselves. Primarily, he added, these are the very people we care about most. At the very heart of the Bishop's response is the fact that the Christian faith is rooted in a call to care for all we love as if they are ourselves. It's the way Christians are meant to show their love of God. Their responsibility and response isn't exclusive to Christianity or to other religious people, but there is a reason, for instance, why passive references are still often made in many newspaper headlines, for instance, to the story of the Good Samaritan, and not passing by on the other side. These parables still form a framework for understanding our responsibility. When the Prime Minister addresses the nation tomorrow, it's worth bearing in mind Dr. Kluger's observation. This is no time for celebration, but time to prepare instead for what lies ahead. In doing so, our responsibility for the security of the most vulnerable in our society should be a critical factor in how we respond as the story continues to unfold.
That was Thought for the Day with the Reverend Dr. Rob Marshall. The time now is 11 minutes to 8.
As the stay-home message changes and people who have been working from home consider or are told to return to work, how will the public transport system manage numbers going back up while maintaining distancing? The Transport Secretary will use today's Downing Street briefing to ask us all to walk or cycle more. Rebecca Newsom is Head of Politics at Greenpeace, and Adam Leishman is also with us, the owner of Whippet, one of the UK's oldest bus companies, which operates routes in Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. Good morning.
Good morning.
Adam Leishman, what does this next phase mean for your business?
Look, I think it's a real challenge for the public transport industry. Obviously, we need to look after everyone that's using public transport the best we can, but that means some real challenges for particularly the small businesses and the large businesses operating public transport systems. To give you an example, if you apply good social distancing rules, you're looking at a 50% reduction in capacity on buses, and our margins well and truly don't cover that. So, the industry is facing a massive question of, how we cope with the new normal.
So 50% reduction because it's sort of one empty seat needs to be left for every full one?
Effectively, yes. And then in addition to that, we're cleaning the buses a lot more regularly. We're applying a number of other things to try to keep passengers' safety and drivers' safety at the utmost. So that increases the cost at the same time. So, this becomes a serious question requiring a lot of honest discussion about how we deal with this going forward.
How do you think it should be dealt with?
Well, obviously the safety of the people involved is critical, but we need to be thinking about how we can address the public's confidence in the system again. So I think we need to look at alternate solutions as well. For example, we're looking at air filtration systems. How can we make the experience safer and maybe not have to have social distancing as impacting, as I just explained.
I see, air filtration to sort of give passengers confidence, and indeed I suppose the government confidence that if it's possible to say that people get on a bus and they're relatively safe from the virus.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to think, holistically here as well. I mean, we've got hundreds of thousands of people working in our industry, and they're at home questioning if they've got a job when this is all going back to the new normal. A 50% reduction in passengers minimum with applying social distancing. The cost to run the same service is much larger, obviously, but then the externalities of that as well. I mean, already we were seeing reduction in bus passenger numbers outside of London for the last 20 years. But can you imagine if all those people shift to cars? It would be just a disaster for our cities with the pollution and congestion that would be caused.
Rebecca Newsom from Greenpeace, I mean, we can all see around us that the shift to cycling numbers are up. Is everything going in the right direction, or are you calling for the government to do more than they've already announced, which is about £250 million in new cycle lanes planned?
Yeah, well, it's obviously great to see the government starting to move in the right direction, but we definitely do need to see a lot more. Actually, 8 environmental groups alongside us have written to the government, and actually one of the key things we've asked for is at least £6 billion over the next 5 years, which is needed actually just to meet the government's own target of doubling cycling and increasing walking over the next 5 years. So we really need to make this infrastructure permanent, and we need to see a real transformation in the way that we're using our urban spaces. So we need to increase reallocating road space for walking and cycling, widening pavements, and fundamentally supporting a reduction in private vehicle use, so that when we come out of lockdown, we can protect public health and make sure that we are moving about in a way that is better for people and the climate.
There's clearly quite a big gap between the kind of infrastructure that you're talking about and the time frame for coming out of lockdown, even if it's many months away. What about people who are living in the suburbs where the distance to the centre of their cities might be several miles? For someone who's contemplating commuting by bike for the first time, that's going to feel like a long distance.
Of course, and actually we are saying as well that the government does need to increase its investment in public transport now so that people can have the option to combine different types of active travel. So we could have people using public transport in a safe, socially distanced way alongside a combination of walking and cycling, and actually that way we can clean up our air and our streets while still being safe and doing something better for the planet.
So you would support a subsidy or government support for a company like Adams?
We would definitely support more government intervention to increase public transport at this time, so that both people can move about in a safe way now during lockdown and as there are still restrictions, but so that also as we move away from the restrictions, we actually don't see a spike in private vehicle use, and we're supporting an overall transformation in our travel system towards more public transport and more sustainable options.
Well, what about road improvements or indeed new roads which would benefit public transport like buses as well as private vehicles?
Well, actually, we are calling for the government's 27 billion roads programme to be completely redirected, particularly for the new roads that they're planning on building, so that that money can go towards these more sustainable options. At the moment, the new roads programme really does represent a completely wrong set of priorities for the government.
The new roads.
We need to scrap the new roads, and we really need to properly invest to support sustainable forms of travel that will really allow people to have accessibility across the country in a sustainable way.
Let me come back to Adam Leichman on that. Scrap the new roads, do you have a view on that?
Oh, look, I think for our cities to be as functional as possible and sustainable as possible going forward, the focus needs to be on public transport and, like you're saying, cycling, walking, these options combined. I think personal motor vehicles, the more we have people living in cities, if people are all going to use a car, the roads are not workable anymore. So if we keep building more roads, they will just clog up with more personal vehicles. We need to be prioritising public transport. It's still the most efficient and safe way to travel. Like's just been said, the pollution reduction, the clean air, the congestion impact, absolutely, I support that.
What do your buses run on?
Diesel at the moment, and we're starting to do some trials of electric with the University of Cambridge.
Yes, but only at trial stage. Rebecca Newsom, how soon would you like to see the fuel that buses like Adams run on shift?
Well, we need to see proper investment and innovation to support the transition towards much more sustainable fuels for buses. We can move even faster when it comes to cars and vans. Actually, we are calling now for the government to end the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030. We know that they're currently consulting on that now, and the date is 2040 for the government. So we need to bring that forward so that we can actually meet our climate targets, but also stop the risk of our roads from being polluted by toxic air as soon as possible.
Rebecca Newsom, Adam Leichman, thank you both.
And now at 3 minutes to 8, is it cycling or walking weather? Let's hear from Louise Lear. Good morning.
Good morning. It is, but you need to dress appropriately for the weekend, because it's all changed from tomorrow. For today, it's another glorious day across England and Wales. Hardly a breath of air out there. Really spells of sunshine already starting to lift those temperatures, and it's going to be a pleasant afternoon. So if you are going to be out and about for a brief spell today, it's worth bearing in mind there could be a few sharp showers developing into the afternoon, 1 or 2 heavy and thundery ones. They should be fairly isolated. Temperatures low 20s for many, perhaps as high as 25 5 degrees in the southeast. Now for Scotland and Northern Ireland, a change already, particularly to the northwest of the Great Glen. There's a cold front that's going to bring some rain, some of it heavy, and the winds will strengthen, gusting in excess of 40 miles an hour as we go through the day. Ahead of that, clouding over as we go through the afternoon with a few sharp showers, and behind that heavy rain it's going to feel noticeably colder. So tomorrow, colder for all, windy as well, and a little bit of light patchy rain. That's it. Enjoy your weekend.
Louise, thank you very much. Now let's hear what's returning to Radio 4 tomorrow morning.
Sharing the music that has shaped people's lives. The new series of Desert Island Discs.
When people looked at me, they decided who I was based on my body, and I wanted fashion to be a tool to redefine that.
Our castaways reveal the treasured songs that tell their stories, starting with the Poet Laureate, Simon Armitage.
I still feel that when I'm looking at a poem, that I'm staring at some kind of circuit board of language, which makes a contactless contact with something in my head, and something occurs.
Desert Island Discs on BBC Radio 4, starting tomorrow morning at 11.
In the next hour of this programme, the view of working in intensive care by a doctor, the surprise letters from children which delighted some people living in care homes, and the delights of swifts and warblers.
You're listening to Today on BBC Radio 4. It's 8 o'clock on Saturday, the 9th of May. The headlines this morning. Airlines say that people arriving in the UK will soon be asked to go into quarantine, and they warn the move could further devastate their industry. The government is to urge people to cycle or walk when they return to work to take the pressure off public transport. And a group of epidemic modellers have issued a joint statement defending the science behind the lockdown. The BBC News is read by Zeb Soanes.
British-based airlines have been told that the government is to introduce a 14-day quarantine period for almost everybody arriving in the UK. Ministers are expected to detail the new restrictions during a conference call with the aviation industry this morning, and the measures are expected to come into effect at the end of the month. UK airports have warned that the proposals would have a devastating impact on the aviation industry and the wider economy. Our transport correspondent Tom Burridge reports.
Sources say people would have to provide an address when they arrive in the UK and self-isolate there for 2 weeks, unless they're coming in from the Republic of Ireland. Lorry drivers and other key workers would be exempt. It's not clear how long the restriction will be in place initially. Airlines and airports said the measure should come with a clear exit strategy. They want it reviewed on a weekly basis, and they fear it will compound the acute damage the pandemic has done to their industry, because it might put some people off travelling if it's still in place when restrictions lift. If a quarantine is necessary now, some will question why it wasn't necessary weeks ago. Tens of thousands of people have flown into the UK during the pandemic. The government has said the vast majority were returning home.
Airport operators said the proposal would have a really big impact on the sector. The chairman of Cornwall Airport, Newquay, Tim Jeans, told us that the apparent reversal of the government's existing policy on borders was frustrating.
If we look at the example of other countries that have successfully managed this pandemic, and New Zealand comes to mind, lockdown was part of the initial response. Our initial response was that the borders were going to remain open, and now it does look, even though we're now potentially past the peak, we're now going to close our borders, and all the plans that airlines and airports had to start restarting operations are now on the scrap heap, and we'll have to go back to square one.
The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps is today expected to encourage people to walk and cycle more when lockdown measures are relaxed. There are fears roads could become gridlocked as people return to work, and environmental groups are urging the government to invest in other forms of travel. Cycle-to-work schemes for emergency service workers have already seen a 200% increase in bicycle orders during the pandemic. Here's our Chief Environment Correspondent, Justin Rowlett.
The BBC has learned that Grant Shapps will urge us all to choose more active forms of travel when lockdown eases and people begin to return to work. Maintaining social distancing rules means buses and trains will be able to carry far fewer passengers. The roads will be choked with traffic if people opt to drive instead. So Mr. Shapps is expected to use this afternoon's government press conference to outline a vision in which we all walk and cycle more to protect our transport networks. He's understood to be planning to announce extra funding and new powers for local authorities in England to ensure they can close roads to vehicle traffic and set aside more space for pedestrians and cyclists.
Leading figures in modelling epidemics have issued a joint statement defending the scientific evidence underpinning the lockdown, after one expert, Professor Neil Ferguson, was forced to resign from the scientific committee advising the government. They've written a letter insisting that what they call his error of judgment when he broke the social distancing rules he had advocated shouldn't be used to discredit the lockdown science